Do you know the difference between a boxer and a natural disaster? Boxers score points. Natural disasters destroy. Throughout human history, countless fighters have stepped into the ring, but only one man made his opponent surrender the moment he looked into their eyes, before the bell even rang. That man was Mike Tyson. But before he became Iron Mike, there was just a frightened child trying to survive on the streets of Brooklyn. Every legend has an origin story. Mike's began in that old rundown gym in Catskill. On one side stood a boy who had been rejected and had failed all his life. On the other, an old master who turned the psychological war inside boxing into an art form. Cus D'Amato. Cus didn't just teach Mike how to box, he gave him armor. You've probably heard of the peekaboo style. The shoulders are positioned to protect the chin, the head is constantly moving, and it creates the illusion that punches pass right through you. But beneath that style was a deeper philosophy Cus instilled in Mike. Fear is like fire. If you can't control it, it will burn you. But if you use it correctly, it will warm you and give you power. While under Cus's guidance, Mike didn't just train physically. He spent hours watching black and white fight footage. He memorized Jack Dempsey and Rocky Marciano. Cus programmed Mike's mind like a computer. When he stepped into the ring, he wasn't just a 20-year-old young man. He was the embodiment of an unstoppable boxing legacy from the 1920s. Think about the period between 1985 and 1988. Tyson's rise defied natural laws with its speed. When he won a fight by knockout, it wasn't just a sporting victory. It meant the complete destruction of his opponent's confidence. Do you remember the looks on his opponents' faces before they stepped into the ring? Those weren't expressions of, "Can I win?" They were filled with the fear of, "Will I make it out of here alive tonight?" Here's the key point we need to analyze. Why was Tyson so terrifying? His power? Yes, that was a major factor. His speed? Absolutely extraordinary. But his greatest weapon was his intensity. Tyson wasn't simply fighting his opponents, he hunted them. Like a predator circling its prey, Tyson would seize control of the center of the ring. Despite his short stature, he would draw his opponents in, lure them into his territory, and then finish the job with that famous uppercut. To describe Mike Tyson as merely powerful is like describing a nuclear bomb as a big firework. It has nothing to do with reality. What he did when he stepped into the ring was, in fact, pure geometry in motion. While spectators saw punches, what were experts missing? The footwork. The peekaboo style wasn't just a defense, it was an offensive trigger. Look at those circular head movements Cus D'Amato taught him. As Mike slipped under his opponent's punch, he was actually creating an arc. When the opponent threw into empty air, Mike had already closed the distance. Physically, Mike was like a parasite that could seize his opponent's safe zone within seconds. As opponents threw punches, they were unknowingly preparing their own downfall, because Mike always finished them at their weakest point. Atlantic City, the Michael Spinks fight. 91 seconds. The world expected one of the greatest heavyweight clashes in history. The result? An execution. Do you remember Spinks' trembling hands in the locker room before the fight? Those were not the hands of a boxer. They were the hands of a man awaiting his sentence. Mike had knocked Spinks out with his eyes before they even entered the ring, even at the weigh-in. When a man begins to feel like a god, it signals the beginning of his downfall. By late 1988, boxing was no longer a sport for Mike Tyson. It had become a repetition. Everyone knew the knockout was inevitable. The only question was when. But here, an important question emerges. Was his mind built to carry the weight of those victories? No, it never was. The death of Cus D'Amato severed the connection in Mike's mind. Cus was not just a trainer, he was a moral compass. When he died, Mike was left like a ship stranded in the middle of an ocean, compassless and with a locked rudder. The crowd of yes men surrounding him erased his sense of reality. Mike was no longer an individual, he had become an industry. Managers, friends, fake admirers, everyone wanted something from him. He grew larger inside the ring, but smaller outside of it. He built an empire of fear around himself, yet he couldn't let anyone inside it. Because trust was seen as weakness, and Mike Tyson was terrified of being the weakest thing in the world. February 11th, 1990, Tokyo. The night not just a boxer, but a legend came to an end. Remember Tyson in the ring against Buster Douglas? That was not the Mike Tyson you knew. His movements were heavy. The killer instinct was gone from his eyes. His breathing was uneven. Why? Because Mike did not prepare physically for that fight. He entered that match armed only with his belief that he would win. And he learned the greatest lesson in sports in the most painful way possible. Talent can carry indiscipline only so far. For someone accustomed to hearing the screams of thousands, the silence of a prison cell hits harder than the fiercest punch. 1992, Tyson went to prison at the peak of his fame. People on the outside still believed he was Iron Mike. But inside, Tyson came face to face with a monster he had never encountered before: his own mind. This is what draws the most attention from wrecked logic: psychological isolation. When we examine Tyson's prison records, the books he read, and his relationships with the guards, we encounter a completely different character. The man who hurt people in the ring was spending his time in his cell reading Tolstoy, Machiavelli, and immersing himself in literature. Was this a contradiction or a defense mechanism? In prison, Tyson was trying to discover his true self. But there was one problem. Who was Mike Tyson without the identity of a boxer? Prison did not make Mike Iron Mike. It made him Wounded Mike. When he came out, the unstoppable child was gone. In his place stood a man who knew he had something to lose. For a fighter, that is the most terrifying state of all. Fearlessness had been replaced by the obligation to climb back to the top. Then came the late 90s. Mike returned. But the fight world was no longer what it had been in the 80s. There was a new obstacle in front of him: Evander Holyfield. From an analytical perspective, when we examine the Holyfield-Tyson fights, we see that this was not merely a boxing match. It was a clash between two different methods of survival. Mike wanted to defeat his opponent through intimidation. Holyfield understood that fear was Mike's greatest weapon. Holyfield could withstand Mike's assault in the first 3 rounds. And when that initial storm faded and Mike saw his opponent still standing, he began to feel panic. Tyson could not comprehend Holyfield's strategy. Holyfield would repeatedly meet Mike's famous uppercut with his head, clinch him, disrupt his balance, and inflict damage. For Mike, this was no longer a boxing contest. It was an insult. Because Mike was not used to anyone telling him no inside the ring. 1997, Las Vegas. The strangest, most unthinkable event in boxing history. The biting incident. People called it madness. They said, Tyson lost it. But as wrecked logic, we look at it from the fighter's perspective. When a boxer becomes technically helpless in the ring, what does he do? If he has no plan, the system collapses. Tyson's system had collapsed. Holyfield's constant head clashes did not just exhaust Mike's patience, they shattered his dream of being an invincible god. After the Holyfield fight, the world never looked at Mike Tyson the same way again. What's interesting is that Mike no longer saw himself the same way either. The biting incident in the ring was not merely an act that resulted in a suspension from boxing. It was also a rejection of the monstrous image the boxing world had imposed on him. The boxing community didn't love Mike as a fighter, they loved him as a gladiator. When a lion enters a cage, people want to see it hunt. When Mike stopped hunting inside that cage, the audience turned their backs on him. The title he had carried for so long, the baddest man on the planet, suddenly became a chain around his neck. People no longer feared him, they pitied him. And for a fighter, if there is anything worse than not being feared, it is being pitied. Wrecked Logic viewers understand this well. Money does not change a person's character, it only magnifies it. Mike Tyson earned over $300 million, and he spent that money as if he were trying to extinguish a raging fire. When he declared bankruptcy in 2003, it wasn't just a financial collapse, it was the collapse of Tyson's self-sustaining grand ego. Remember the Tyson of that era, the man everyone labeled a loser, the one people mocked, the one who had almost become a caricature of himself. His fights were no longer subjects of technical debate. They had become mere entertainment. When Mike entered the ring, he was no longer performing analysis. He was simply collecting a paycheck. Watching a legend crushed under the weight of his own legacy was painful for the world of sports. But this is where the most fascinating part of the story begins. Just when everyone believed Michael would be lost forever, he did the impossible. He rebuilt his own legend. How? Not as a fighter, but as a philosopher. Do you remember that famous cameo scene in The Hangover? Mike Tyson made fun of himself. He took his terrifying image, broke it apart, and turned it into comedic material. That is the secret to surviving in the modern world. Irony. Mike Tyson no longer allowed anyone to call him a monster because he had become something else. A man who acknowledged the monster within, yet transcended it. The world of podcasts became his new ring. Now he defeats opponents not with punches, but with stories. People spend hours listening to his deep, raspy voice as he speaks about the meaning of life, trauma, and mistakes. As Wrecked Logic, our conclusion is this. Mike Tyson may have lost as a boxer, but as a human being, he is one of the rare individuals who managed to escape the dark labyrinth of his own mind. Was Mike Tyson the last great warrior of boxing? Or was boxing the only place that could not contain someone like Mike Tyson? As Wrecked Logic, when we look back, it is impossible to define Tyson's profession with a single word. He was like a summary of contradictions wearing boxing gloves. A figure who was both victim and executioner. He carried the innocence of a child while harboring the brutality of a monster within. The moment Iron Mike stood in the ring, he wasn't just throwing punches at his opponent. He was transforming the feeling of fear inside his opponent's mind into a physical assault. Yet that power was his only friend, and the thick armor that isolated him from life itself. Tyson taught us that to reach the peak of life, we sometimes leave a piece of our soul behind. But when you descend from that peak, you cannot simply retrieve the piece you left there. You must rebuild it. When you look at Mike Tyson today, you no longer see those eyes that seemed programmed to kill. Now there is a man who has acknowledged his mistakes, made peace with his own darkness, and transformed it into lessons. Tyson is no longer just a boxer. He has become living proof of something greater. If you ask what that proof is, a person can lose everything: money, fame, reputation, even their sanity. But once they begin to write their own story, everything can be rewritten. Mike Tyson may not be the answer to how to live, but he is an example of how to survive. He became a storyteller who escaped from hell and returned with stories powerful enough to move us. The boxing era is over. The legend of Iron Mike has been set aside. But the human Mike continues to battle the old chaos within him every single day. Perhaps his greatest victory was not the knockouts he delivered in the ring, but his ability to stop the destruction outside of it and somehow keep living. In this episode of Wrecked Logic, we examined not only the life of a boxer, but the fragmentation of a human being, and how those fragments came back together to form an entirely different whole. Mike Tyson is not someone who will be buried in history books. He is an example of human nature pushed to its limits. Someone who rises stronger after every fall and continues living with his mistakes. So which do you think is harder, defeating a champion in the ring or controlling the inner monster outside of it? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. And if you enjoyed this detailed analysis, let us know which legend you would like us to explore in the next episode of Wrecked Logic. Thank you for watching. Remember, every collapse marks the beginning of a new understanding. Goodbye.